Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
At a talk recorded on the 6th of June 2016, A.C. Grayling discussed the case for humanism.
Thank you very much, Joe. That's very kind indeed. Thank you. Well, it's always good to start, as we were advised by Confucius to do, to rectify names. That is, to be clear what labels we are using actually denote. And Joel was quite right to point out that the first use of the term humanism comes to us from the Renaissance period, when people, among them chiefly Erasmus, but a whole host of others too, came to give value, renewed and recovered value, to the outlook and the enjoyments that they discovered in classical literature. You may know that from the time of Petrarch onwards, a lot of the manuscripts which had survived from classical antiquity were discovered in dusty corners of monasteries or were recovered from the Arabic world, were published in the middle of the 15th century with printing coming into full force. The opportunity to explore this literature and the world view that it contained was a very rich one. And so an interest in what the thinkers, writers, poets, historians, letter writers of classical antiquity were interested in, that is to say, in human life, in the here and now, between cradle and grave, was able to flourish. And there was a very marked contrast between that period and the period that had just preceded it, the medieval age, when most of the art tended to focus on things like the crucifixion, the deposition, the resurrection, the virgin birth, and so on. Most of the literature was contemptuous mundi literature, contempt of the world, reminding us or telling us that this is a vale of tears in which, just so long as we can hang on and not sin too much so we don't have to spend too long in purgatory, we might just about be okay. But what the Renaissance rediscovered, and why it is a rebirth, is a delight in the possible pleasures and values of life in the here and now. And that is why Renaissance art celebrates landscapes and portraits of ordinary people and picnics and still lives of flowers, and why poetry and romance and the troubadours were so entertaining and so enjoyed. Really a major change. And humanism was then conceived of as the study of humane letters, so the letters about human experience and humankind, a rediscovery and appraisal and an application of the ideas afresh in the poetry of the time, in the writings and the philosophy of the time, of those ideas from classical antiquity. Now, plenty of people, and again, one cites the name of Erasmus, in that period of Renaissance humanism were religious. And so you sometimes see the phrase Christian humanism or Renaissance humanism, and there is no distinction there between somebody's being religious but also having an interest in the letters of antiquity. And so the term humanism applied to the Renaissance period denotes an interest in classical literature and thought. It doesn't denote what it does now, in our modern era, an approach to life, a way of thinking about ethical concerns which is non-religious in character. So the term humanism has changed its meaning. It changed its meaning for a very natural and obvious reason, which is that people in the Renaissance period of humanism, with their interest in what the ancients had been thinking about and writing about, after a while began to lose an interest in the religious dimension and stuck just with the lessons of classical antiquity. This is a generalization, and we're in 7-league boots here, but if you go forward to the 18th century, for example, you find David Hume saying that he wished that when he was a schoolboy he hadn't been introduced to the scriptures of Christianity but just to Cicero. And this is a characteristic way of showing how humanism evolved from a study of the literature and thought of classical antiquity to an attitude to life and particularly to ethical considerations, which is derived from the literature and philosophy of antiquity. So I'm making a strong claim here, which is that you can see two great strands of thought in the history of the last 2,500 years. One, the more ancient, the deeper, the richer strand, beginning from the time of Plato and Aristotle, which we think of as the humanist tradition in ethics, occluded for a time when the young religions of the world, Christianity and Islam, the first from about the late 4th century of the Common Era, the second from about the 7th century of the Common Era, took over the task of telling people what to think, how to behave, and what to believe in the way of the conduct of life. So the ancient humanist tradition was, as I say, occluded, or at any rate only kept alive like a little candle flickering in the dark by the most educated and thoughtful people who wouldn't avow their adherence to a secular version of humanism, because of course they might end up being burned at the stake if they did. So for quite a period of time, from about the end of the 4th century until the Renaissance, there wasn't very much mention of the humanist tradition. But when we look at the roots of humanism, we find them in two thinkers of the past, Socrates and Aristotle. Now, Socrates, as you know, didn't write anything. And what we know of Socrates himself and what he thought about things, we can discern somewhat dimly in the earlier dialogues of Plato. In the middle and later dialogues of Plato is Plato that we're reading about, and Socrates is just his mouthpiece. But we do see this interesting figure challenging people to think about what they meant by the concepts they employed when they were thinking about matters of value and of life. Now, Socrates lived at a very significant moment in the history of civilizations, including our own Western civilization. Sometimes people, as you know, talk about the axial age. You've heard that expression perhaps. You know that Socrates was born just 10 years after both Confucius and Gautama, the Buddha, died. So they're of a time. And all three of them, Gautama and Confucius and Socrates, were philosophers, not religious figures, not religious teachers, and their teaching isn't religious. You know, the Buddha asked his disciples not to turn him into a god and not to turn his teaching into a religion, but alas, we've all seen the life of Brian, so we know the shoe. People do tend to turn their great teachers into godlike figures. But the point for them was, this was an age of transition from the warrior virtues, thinking about what a good person is, or particularly a good man. A good woman just kept her mouth shut and did the cooking and so on. But a good man was somebody who would defend the tribe or the city, had courage, fortitude, endurance, was prepared to lay down his life to protect his own. And that idea, the idea of the warrior virtues, is contained in the very word virtue, which is a word of Latin origin, but the first syllable, vir, V-I-R, means man in the masculine sense. So virtue was this idea of the warrior characteristics. But at the time we're thinking of, the axial age, there was this great shift of emphasis to thinking about the civic virtues, the virtues of living together in society, of cooperation, of what we owe to our fellows in society, and how we can build good relationships with them. And that was what Socrates was very keen to find out. He wanted to find out what his fellows in Athens thought about these matters. And that's why in those early dialogues of Plato you see him challenging people. What do you mean by continence? What do you mean by courage? What do you mean by kindness? What do you mean by the good? Because he wanted to point out to people that they hadn't thought these things through carefully. But the focus of attention in Socrates was on the question of the good and worthwhile life and of good relationships which lie at the very heart of such lives. That is why when you read the first great systematic treatise of ethics, which is Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, so called because his son Nicomachus edited it, you see it expressly addresses the question of what it is to live the best kind of life. And there are two components to it, one of which Aristotle takes directly from Socrates. You remember Socrates said, never told us what particular things would constitute the good and worthwhile life, but he did say, and he always insisted, that such a life would be one considered and chosen. In fact, he put the point negatively. He said the unconsidered life, that is, the life not thought about and not chosen by the person living it, is not worth living, because it's a life lived according to somebody else's idea of what a good life should be. So the considered life, the chosen life. And that's what Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics focuses on, the idea of the life which is reasoned about. The most distinctive thing about us, he said, is our possession of reason. And so we must think about how we are to navigate our way through the world and how we're to relate to others. And he devoted 2 whole books of the Nicomachean Ethics to the question of friendship, which he thought of as the most achieved of relationships. If you can become friends with your parents when you grow up, or friends with your kids when they grow up, friends with your lovers and spouses and so on, even though they remain all these things too, but that means that you've got to a position of closeness with these other people who really matter to you and about whom you care, which is the very best kind of relationship available to people. So he was thinking about this idea of the life that feels good to live and which has in it these good relationships. And if you look at the post-Aristotelian ethical schools, especially the Epicureans and the Stoics, and remember that Stoicism, for half a millennium, was the outlook of educated and thoughtful people in the Hellenic and Roman worlds. And Stoicism is a very profound and a rather beautiful ethical outlook. It says, with respect to those things that you cannot control, age, disease, tsunamis, earthquakes, you must face them with courage, live with courage. And with respect to those things you do have some control over, your own appetites and fears and desires, try to achieve some degree of self-mastery. So if you could live with courage in the outward-facing aspect of your life and self-mastery with the inward-facing aspect, you would be living with nobility. That was the Stoic ideal. And this was the ideal, as I say, of educated people right up to the time that Christianity officially became the religion of the Roman Empire when the Edict of Thessalonica was promulgated in the year 380 AD. Christianity having been decriminalized just 67 years before in the Edict of Milan in 313 AD by the Emperor Constantine, but thereby hangs a completely different and curly tale, which I can tell you about later if you want. But this great tradition for nearly 1,000 years, think of it, from the time of Socrates in the 5th century before the Common Era until the late 4th century of the Common Era, so that's 900 years, that tradition of thought about ethics was a humanistic tradition. It didn't use that name didn't exist, but in all fundamentals it was. Why? Because it is premised on the idea that how we live is a matter of responsibility for us individually, based on our best understanding of human nature and the human condition, of what other human beings are, of how we can relate to them well, and of our thinking about and applying reason to the choices that we make about our lives. And this is why if we leapfrog the Renaissance use of the term humanism to be, well, let's be interested in the passage between cradle and grave, which is human experience, leaving the transcendent and the posthumous to look after themselves, and come right forward to what we mean by the word humanism now, today, we find that what we mean is this, that humanism is not an ism. That is, it's not a doctrine. It's not a teaching. It doesn't have a whole lot of do's and don'ts. It just has one demand and one suggestion. The demand is think. Think for yourself. Now, you all know, because it's a standing joke, especially among people interested in philosophy, what Bertrand Russell said on this head, that most people would rather die than think, and most people do. So this adjuration to think is a serious one. And it's not always easy to do. I mean, supposing somebody says to you, you should really think about the principles on which you base your life. Think about what you value. Think about how you're going to live. Somebody could point out to you that Epictetus, one of the great teachers of late Stoicism, used to say to his pupils, and he had pupils of all ages, by the way, from 3 and 4 all the way up to 94. And he used to say to them, all of them, every evening when they left his class, he would say to them, "Tell me, how long will you delay to be wise?" He would say this to them because he wanted them to accept this difficult responsibility of thinking for themselves. Now, if somebody did say that to you, think about your principles, you say, "Right, I'm going to do that. Saturday afternoon, 3 o'clock, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to think about my principles," and you did that, and you even struck the Rodin-esque pose and so on, what's likely to happen? Well, the answer is you're likely to go blank for a bit, and then you're likely to think, "Oh, I forgot such and such in Tesco," and then you're likely to think, "Oh, I should phone my mum." You know, those sorts of errant thoughts will come in instead of deep, profound philosophical thoughts. And so the question, how do you think about these matters, is a question about, well, indeed, it's not a question, it's an invitation, really, to take part in the process of trying out ideas on other people, of reading, of listening to what other people say, of challenging them, of trying to work out what it is you really do deeply feel about what matters and how you should be living conformably with those things that do seem important. That, in other words, to think philosophically is to be a philosopher. And as you know, we're all philosophers. You know how in the pub in the evening, as the evening wears on, you get smarter and smarter and more profound. And that usually happens because we address those great questions. And those are wonderful opportunities, really, to explore the ideas that we're challenged by Socrates and the whole tradition of this kind of thinking to address. So humanism is one demand: think for yourself, take responsibility for your thoughts. And the suggestion, the other thing that characterizes humanism, is this: in your dealings with other people, with other human beings, try to start anyway by exercising your most sympathetic and your most generous approach to them. I mean, after all, it's not always easy to be a human being. I mean, we all have tough times. We all sometimes fall into despair or feel sorrow or grief, or we lose people we care about. Sometimes we make mistakes and we have to pick ourselves up. You know, so it's not always easy to be a human being. And you have to remember the little story which is told about Ludwig Wittgenstein, who, as you know, was a very eccentric character. And his sister Hermione said to him one day, "Ludwig," she said, well, I imagine she did, "Ludwig, we can't understand you. We in the Wittgenstein family just don't understand why you behave as you do." And he said, "You're like a person who looks out of the window, sees somebody walking in the street in a very odd way, sort of a bit like, you know, Monty Python, Ministry of Funny Walks. And what you don't understand is that there is a powerful wind blowing against this person. He's trying to make headway against it. That's why he's walking in a funny way. But you don't know that he's struggling against a headwind." But of course, all of us have great headwinds in the inner spaces of our lives, and we do things that we regret later or which we find difficult to do. And therefore, the sympathy and generosity of our fellows in the human story is a very valuable thing. So if we approach people with that attitude, and this is what humanism says, be generous, be sympathetic. It's only when people behave so badly that they've crossed the line and you think, well, the heck with you, you know, I'm not going to waste my time on you. And that's fair enough, because remember what Aristotle said: it's good to be angry sometimes for the right reason, in the right way, and to the right degree. And that is because some people do bad things, so we shouldn't accept that. It's the sort of ethical parallel of the thing about having an open mind. You know, they say how valuable it is to have an open mind, but not so open that your brains fall out. So the same thing is true about your ethical approach to other people. Give people all the space and possibility to be their own individual selves and to be kind to them. Kindness is, I think, at the very heart of the humanist outlook. But not to the extent that anything goes, obviously. So humanism is a very simple starting point. It says the things of this life are full of opportunities for value, and we can find good and we can make good, and we can make our lives meaningful. And this, of course, it's a very key point. I mean, black cab drivers in London are always asking me when they find out that I'm a professor of philosophy. They say, all right, Governor, what's the meaning of life then? And I say, well, I know the answer to that question. And they're all amazed, you know. I said, not because I discovered it, but because the great tradition of ethical debate has offered us that answer. And the answer is, the meaning of your life is what you make it. But there's not a one-size-fits-all answer. This is where humanism differs so dramatically from the great religions of the world, because the great religions say there is a one-size-fits-all answer. Believe this, do that, and you get into heaven or something. So, but it's all one-size-fits-all. And yet the great diversity and difference and individuality and particularity of human beings is such that each of us has his or her own set of talents and capacities for making a life which really does feel good to live and does have good relationships in it, if we were thoughtful about it and if we made those Socratic choices. And that's what humanism is about. Humanism is about human beings. It's about human life. It's about human possibility. It's about human suffering. It's about the fact that everything of light in our lives also casts shadows, and to be brave enough to address them in our own person and sympathetic enough to respond to them in other people is what it is to be a good neighbour to oneself and to others in the human story. So you can see that humanism is a sort of starting point. It's an attitude or orientation. And it's not a doctrine. It doesn't say you've got to vote in or out in the EU referendum, or you've got to vote for this party or that party. It leaves those things open to sensible, rational reflection. And it asks you to be what is so distinguishing of us at our best, and that is reasonable and kind. And what follows from that is something that you have a responsibility to work out. That's what humanism is. Now, I was asked, I'm going to end on this point now so we can have a conversation, but the title of this talk was The Case for Humanism, as if there was, going to be asked to give an argument as to why we should be humanists. And thereby hangs another long and curly tail, because, of course, the first thing that one would want to say is that in their different ways, the religions of the world, both in their metaphysics and in their ethics, are just insufficient as accounts of the realities. They're premised on ancient stories, which are, on the whole, not true. They're made up. They emerge from the ignorance of our remote forebears and ancestors. And that in an age where we have so many opportunities to learn about our world, about the universe that we occupy, and about other people, it behoves us to be much more informed and rational in our approach to things. And one of the great advantages of the whole world becoming humanists, everybody in the world becoming humanists and dropping all their religions, is that because religion is so fruitful and fertile in divisions, in separating people from one another, in making people anxious or zealous or angry or opposed to people who think differently from them. It has been such a ripe source of conflict throughout history and of misery, not just in the nature of wars and persecutions and inquisitions, but also in individual lives of people who have been taught that certain things they think or feel or do are wrong, and they've suffered because of it, when those things are completely natural. The amazing thing about religion is that it's so obsessed with sex and doesn't want people to do it or know about it, or only to do it with certain people on certain times of their lives and so on. That it seems astonishing, really, to consider that the concentration on not allowing divorced people to remarry in church should be such a big issue for a certain religious outlook, while next door arms are being manufactured and sent around to countries where there are terrible conflicts going on, and much bigger crimes being committed in our world than the sorts of things that religious moralities obsess over. And so to be a humanist is to be a human being, and to see oneself as part of this great family of human beings, and always to begin our approach to the people that we meet in the world as something that should be predicated on this idea of being generous to others. It has one, and again, I really will end. It has one other little stricture, which is this. for some reason, human beings, I suppose out of a very natural desire to belong, have always been a little too wedded to identities that give them that sense of belonging. And we find in our world today that identity politics is a very unhappy source of a lot of conflict. So somebody comes at you wearing a big crucifix or a burqa or some other insignium of belonging to something, and by implication demanding of you that you treat them as a representative of that kind rather than as an individual human being. Now that is something that a humanist, I think, should resist. Because what a humanist should do, I think, is to see another human being first and foremost as a human being. It doesn't matter what their sex or sexuality or ethnicity or age or anything else about them, but just another human being as a human being first and foremost, sharing all those things that we as human beings share. I said earlier that we are very diverse, which is why you can't have a one-size-fits-all. But there are enough commonalities in human experience. Very, very few of us like to be cold or alone or tortured or imprisoned or deprived of opportunities. And so that's why we can think in terms of, say, human rights, regimes of human rights, which are par excellence encapsulations of humanistic ethics. When Eleanor Roosevelt and her team drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948 and was accepted by the new United Nations in that year, against the background of the terrors and horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust that had just happened and been discovered, that was a statement of how, on the basis of what we share as human beings, we can think of the good for humanity without any reference whatever to divine command or religious traditions and the like. And so, for me anyway, the UN Declaration is a wonderful statement of humanist principles, and it comes out of this long, rich tradition which we can ascribe all the way back to classical antiquity. Thank you.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and Dance City. We're also supported by DC Cafe, who host the events.